lovely to see you again. Thanks for coming back to Inverness.
Really lovely to be here.
Great for you to bring half of your team with you as well. Which
yeah,
is really
and the
exciting.
weather, right? Look at this weather. It's
we actually have this all the time. I don't know that you can take the credit for that, but okay.
I live in Scotland, remember?
Yeah, I know. Anyway, listen, I thought it would be really nice just to have a bit of a chat, pick up on some of the issues that we're hearing at a local level, and just put a few questions to you and see what you can tell us.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Let's go.
So I guess the first one really is about the capacity of the Highlands and Islands to help support delivery of Clean Power 2030. We've clearly are blessed with great resources, great facilities. You know, what role do you see our region playing in delivery of the targets?
Well, I'm not here for kicks. So I've worked on this stuff 15 and a bit years actually, and my early part of my career on energy and climate was in the Scottish Government. Yep. And I always felt that High had it right on this, that they understood the projects, they understood the developers, they also understood the communities that were going to host this stuff, and they understood the people who are going to work in these industries. So it's very exciting to come back to that. The job I'm doing now is trying to shepherd the country towards a clean power system by 2030. That is probably one of the most ambitious things that any government in the world is trying to do right now. The pace and the scale and the speed at which we need to move to make that happen is genuinely unprecedented. And it ain't going to happen unless we can have High's region, the north of Scotland in particular, support the many things that we need to build a clean power system. So that's about grid. Yep. The grid build's really important. It's about ports. It's about offshore wind deployment. It's about building some of the supply industries that go into that sector. It's also about things like pumped hydro storage. We're in a period when, for clean power, in the phase that we're in now, we can throw everything at it. And there's an enormous benefit to Scotland to this, if we get it right. And I also know that people like me in the past have promised lots of things and not delivered. So a big part of this for me is to get real about what we're actually doing, being sensible about it, being pragmatic about it. As ambitious as we are, I don't want to lead people along. I think that people in this country want to see a cleaner power system, but they're also very cynical about whether government can deliver that. So I want to demonstrate it can.
Can you explain how the price of energy is determined? And given that we produce so much here on our doorstep, why aren't consumers seeing the benefit of lower prices?
So it's never easy to answer these questions, is it? I mean, the main price of energy is determined across whatever energy form you find by global markets. Now, I deal with the power system, so it's the price of electricity that bothers me. So you might think, as we build out these wind farms, particularly offshore wind farms in Scotland, that we're going to start to see some sort of benefit to the bill. And you would be right to think that, but it's not immediate. Yeah. And the reason it's not immediate is because at the moment, for more than 90% of the time across each year, the price that is set in the wholesale market for electricity, that's the market for those who generate it, it's set by gas. And there is a point in the imminent future when that is not going to be the case quite so much. And basically the key to that is to build out more and more renewables under long-term contracts that are set in a different process called the contract for difference. Mm-hmm. But we're in the period now when it's still gas that's setting the price. Now, I suppose that's fine if the gas price is low, but the gas price has not been low. So historically, we have seen extraordinary pricing of gas, driven by global events. So in the mix for the British energy system at the time when Russia invaded Ukraine, there was only about 6% Russian gas, but we got 100% of the impact of that price increase. That's what's been setting the power price as high as it has been. And there's no one in this country that would like to see it fall more than me. But we've got to see this through. So the goal of clean power is basically to displace that gas as much as we can. We're going to have gas in the system past 2030, but we don't want it having that price setting role anymore. We want to have renewables come onto the system and set the price at a lower level. That's the wholesale price. Then we've got a job of translating that into lower consumer prices. That's partly about the consumer paying back some of the big costs in the energy system that we need to pay for, which is going to drive some of the costs here. It's also, though, about exploring whether consumers might have different ways to save money on their bill. So as we build out a more sort of electrified economy, all those opportunities come with that. So some of the people watching this right now might have an electric car. Yep. Some of those people might be able to plug that in a driveway. They're already seeing some of the benefits of that more flexible power system. I would like to see that rolled out much more widely. Solar panels with batteries, with electric vehicle charging. That is part of the story of how we'll get prices down more quickly, whilst we do the big stuff of building out wind farms and getting the wholesale price to fall. But that is, in the end, the ultimate test of whether we're doing the right thing here. I think we're going to make a dent on this over the next few years.
Good, excellent. So what can be done in terms of market reform or innovation to speed this whole process up, to see the benefits come to the communities that host this infrastructure? You know, how do you see that happening?
Maybe I'll walk you through what we're trying to do with clean power. So the government at UK level was elected last year. The central pledge on energy and on climate was to have a clean power system by 2030. I'm very, very privileged to get to lead that. I work very closely with Ed Miliband. We see the Prime Minister regularly. This is a whole of government thing. I'm going to draw in my colleagues in the Scottish Government to that too, because they're also helping us push towards that, as are many of the people watching this in High. So it's a sort of whole of government focus on trying to clean up the power system as quickly as possible. Now, there's loads of different ways you could do that. I'm a very straightforward guy. So I think you need to, first of all, define what you mean by clean power, which we've done. So we did that in the early months. We got NESO, that's the energy system operator that we have in this country, to define that for us. They gave us some options. We then put a plan around that, and it's the plan that matters. So we pushed that out and got it published before Christmas, and that, and those of you who've worked with government will know, is not an easy thing to do. So we moved as quickly as we could to put a plan around that. That plan, for any of you who haven't read it, is something you should look at. It basically sets out what needs to happen across each of the energy technologies over the next 5 or 6 years. In every single one of those technologies, we are stretching at something that is at the top end of what we think is possible. We've looked at the project list, the project pipeline, and we've worked with the energy system modelers. This is something we think we can achieve, but it is extraordinarily ambitious. Yeah. So we've set that out. So that's sort of plan out there. The next thing is you've got to make that work. Yeah. So just a couple of things to say about that. If you want all that to work, you've got to build a lot of grid. So we've put our arms around that and said that we support that grid build. You've also got to reform the queue of projects that are waiting to connect to the grid. We're doing something very radical on that too, to try and align the projects that are most ready and most able to deliver those strategic goals across the country this year. Yeah. So that's happening right now. And then the final thing, to come to your point about markets, we've also got to do a lot of policy reform to make that happen. Now, I don't want to be doing policy reform for the whole time that I'm in this job, right? It's something, of course, I'm very interested in, but this has got to be the year when we nail that. We've got to lay that out as quickly as possible so that we give as clear a path forward for those projects as we can. So this is the year when we are going to look at reform to the wholesale market for electricity. Some of you might have heard of zonal pricing. That's very much something that's in the decision space right now for us. We may or we may not do that. There's definitely some merits to it. There's also some big issues when it comes to supporting the projects that we need. So we're going to have to work that through in the next few weeks. The other thing is how the contract for difference works. That's very important for onshore wind, offshore wind and solar. And then there's a host of other things which you could basket up as being planning and consenting issues. We've got a bill going through the Westminster Parliament that will make it quicker to develop infrastructure. Part of that is also giving the Scottish Government some new consenting powers that they want to make that work. So there's a host of other things that go with all of that, but those are the sort of big planks of what we need to do. And if we do that this year, the idea is that we give certainty, clarity to developers to develop projects, and also for them to raise the finance for those projects in as certain a way as possible to keep the cost of that as low as possible for the consumer. And you can overcomplicate it. That's what we've got to do, basically, and we can unblock that project pipeline to 2030. We'll be match fit for where we need to be for the decade beyond that.
Brilliant, thank you. Sometimes in the Highlands and Islands we're already producing more energy than we actually need. So is there a plan as part of the reforms that you talked about there underway in terms of how might we use that generation better locally without necessarily needing all of the new grid infrastructure that you also talked about?
There is. So the first thing to say is I think in big terms at the moment in this scale, in this time I'm doing this job, we're still in the early phase of it, and I am definitely thinking at national level for most things. So that leads me to think about big offshore wind farms, think about the transmission infrastructure that we need, the big stuff. And definitely what we need is power production in the north of Scotland going to the demand in the south. So we need a lot of that, right? But I think alongside that, we should also be thinking about local consumption, local power production matched with local demand. And I don't actually like the term community energy, if I'm honest with you. It sort of puts one in mind of a sort of cottage industry, and I don't think it is that. So if you want to facilitate that kind of thing, and I absolutely do, this is, I think, mainly about making sure that we've got the facilities in place to have a more flexible demand system. So we've talked about something called consumer-led flex. And it's very important to me that we develop that. Now, if you want to move as quickly as we do to 2030, in infrastructure terms, that's tomorrow. And I have a pretty good sense of what we need to do for the big projects to deliver what we can by 2030. This will continue beyond 2030. But for consumers and the flex that we have at the demand side, there is loads that we can do. And in a sense, that is the most exciting bit of what we're trying to do once we get beyond the big stuff. Because if we can give the signal to the consumer to consume when the wind blows or when the sun shines, we basically get a cheaper power system overall. And if we can couple that with a bit of community ownership of some of those projects on the generation side, that could also be storage projects. You've got something really exciting in a place like this where the renewables resource is just enormous. Now, I've worked in this for a long time, and the community ownership bit of it is always the dog that hasn't barked yet, it seems to me. So we want to try and support that too. So if you bring that all together, it's just a much more exciting prescription for our energy system, where people, if they want it, can be more participative in energy production and use. Most consumers won't want it, so for the others, we just want to give them cheaper electricity. And I think that's the sauce that will, if we can cook all that together, we'll have a much better outcome at the end of it.
Great, thank you. This is a big issue, I guess, for us here in terms of the generation that we're looking to build out, particularly around offshore wind and onshore. And we're hearing of projects that are having to either postpone or are facing increased charges. To new sort of transmission network use of system charges is a real big one there. What's happening in terms of reform of that to try and make it a more favourable environment for generators to develop their projects? So
we're looking at a number of reforms right now which are not designed solely for Scottish offshore wind projects, but definitely have that in mind. So we've got such good wind resource up here, and we want to make sure that it gets to where it needs to in the centres of demand, which are not always here in Scotland. And we're sort of doing a couple of things on that. The first thing is the grid that we have in this country is still largely what was designed in the 50s, and you basically need to turn that inside out. So you move away from a grid that was designed around coal. That's literally what we were doing in the 1950s and 60s. We looked at where the coal deposits were and we put power stations next to that and then minimised the amount of grid that we built to where people live. Basically need to do that again, but for wind. And the wind resource in Scotland is unrivaled. So a big part of this is about allowing networks to take power north to south, and also for that to reverse when the wind stops blowing. Very exciting to sort of bring that about, but there's a cost to that. The other thing we want to do to try and keep those wind projects themselves as cheap as possible is build a more certain environment for them. So that's partly about giving them a longer view of the likely trajectory for offshore wind, which we've tried to do with our plans. We're going to keep building that out with a plan out to beyond 2030 to 2050. We're also looking, as we speak, at things like a longer contract for difference, reflecting the fact that these projects have longer operational times, and they're massive infrastructure projects. So that is something that at the moment we're considering. If we bring all that together, I think we can create a better environment for Scottish wind, but we're not going to be able to duck the fact that it is going to be expensive to bring that power from the north to the south. And there's a legitimate need to put some charges over that, because you want to give an incentive for power to be developed where it's cheapest. So I happen to think Scotland will come out of that pretty well, but I'm not going to duck the idea that there will be some cost to that, and you see that reflected in the transmission charges, as they're sometimes called. We need to get to the point where wind, despite the transmission charges, is still economic or commercial, and the way we'll do that is because the wind resource itself is better. So if we can get the projects themselves to be developed at a low enough price, and also to put some sort of collar around transmission charging, which we're looking at right now with our colleagues in Ofgem, I'm hopeful that that will give the right set of conditions for us to develop as much offshore wind as I think we can in Scotland, which is just such a huge market. And it's a bit of a lesson, I suppose, to other countries around the world about how we do this if we get it right. This is the point when we will land all of that, I think.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks very much.